And the other problem is we're trying to play with that's what that tends to be. Sent out. Process trying to get people on board with but come to some kind of majority consensus. Take that.
我今天啊，我以为他昨天，因为我看他还在写那个
What would happen? I think the
写水晶，我没知道，我们给他认。所以我就想他们来，以前的。
GDP growth, other things are growing.
实在太奇怪了。
A lot of estimates I don't think so.
当然没有啊，他在美国那边还是要去美国。
Programs
什么时候走？
don't depend on the situation.
他是要去各行。
Because, right, any global team.
哦，那就是你喽。
The Chinese try to block themselves. So, what is that? So,
Thank you.
The other side of the room.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Atlantic Council, to this event on the US-Taiwan arms sale. I'm Barry Pavel. I'm the director of the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security here. And today we really want to look at the prospective arms sale, its significance for regional and really global dynamics, and the potential implications more broadly. This is part of our ongoing Cross-Strait series at the Brent Scowcroft Center in our Asia Security Initiative, and we proudly conduct this series through the very generous support and close working relationship that we have with the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office, and we're very happy to be doing this work, very important work. This event will look at key aspects of the upcoming arms sale, ranging from how it might affect Taiwan's defense and security, how China might react depending on the size and shape of the package, the U.S.-China relationship, and how the arms sale itself might fit into the Trump administration's broader emerging policy on the Asia Pacific. In many ways, when this happens, it will be a major milestone in the development. In general, most observers expect it to be significantly larger than the one that was proffered by towards the end of the Obama administration, although this is what we would call informed speculation. We at the Council have paid special attention to the latest security developments in Asia, as the Brent Scowcroft Center has held several events on the region's dynamics with topics ranging from the Asian arms race, China and cybersecurity, which was a very interesting event, and the future of Taiwan's defense role. In addition, in coming weeks, we will release a comprehensive strategy document that will include security elements for the Asia-Pacific region, for the United States and its allies and partners, not just in Asia, but in Europe. And this falls under the rubric of the Council's desire to build a 12th Atlantic Council Center here, and this center will be focused on the Asia-Pacific. The strategy effort was co-chaired by our chairman, Governor John Huntsman, and by Mr. Victor Chu and former Swedish Prime Minister Carl Bildt, again representing the need to bring the transatlantic and the trans-Pacific communities together to help manage the greatest strategic challenges that we face. So please watch this space soon, and you'll see that very important and interesting effort coming out. Regarding today's topic set, I'm certain that I don't need to outline for this audience the ongoing, dramatic, shifting strategic dynamics in Asia, as I know this is a pretty expert audience. It is worth noting or reminding ourselves that the United States has long committed itself to helping Taiwan and contributing to its self-defense, and has engaged in unofficial diplomatic relations since the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979. American presidents have approved robust arms sales to Taiwan since the Carter administration and have sold Taiwan over $30 billion in weapons since then. The Trump administration undoubtedly will continue that long-standing effort. While Beijing-Washington relations can be considered to be improving, how this arms sale affects the most important bilateral relationship in the world and what the impacts of that are on critical issues of concern, such as the ongoing approach to North Korea, will be addressed by the panel today. There is little doubt that a new U.S.-Asia policy this will be a very important part of that ongoing policy development effort. I'd also like to welcome all of those who are watching online. Please join the conversation on Twitter using hashtag ACAsia and tweeting from the Scowcroft Center account, which is at @ACScowcroft. And with that, I'll let our moderator, Shannon Tiesi, editor at The Diplomat, take it from here and introduce our panel. So thanks a lot, and over to you, Shannon.
Thanks, everyone, for coming out today on a beautiful Friday morning. As you know, we're all going to be talking today about the next arms sale to Taiwan, and Ian has been given the unenviable task of trying to look into his crystal ball and tell us what exactly to expect from that next arms sale. Ian is a research fellow at the Project 2049 Institute, where he conducts research on defense and security issues in Asia. And I'll let you all read the rest of his bio, but he has extensive experience on Taiwan issues and China affairs. And then after Ian, Susan will be taking over to discuss the reaction in the US Congress, as well as what we can expect on China's side. And Susan is well equipped to speak on Congress and China, because she's been a specialist on Asian affairs at the Congressional Research Service, which is affiliated with the Library of Congress for many years, covering People's Republic of China and Taiwan. And then we will end off the prepared remarks with Abraham Denmark, who is an expert on U.S. national security strategy and foreign policy toward the Asia Pacific, and most recently served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia at the U.S. Department of Defense from 2015 through just this January. So welcome to all three of our panelists. We're very happy to have you here, and I will let Ian kick it off.
Well, thank you, Shannon, and a very good morning to you all. It is a pleasure to be here at the Atlantic Council, and it's a privilege to be here discussing such an important topic, and I think a very important time in the history of American foreign policy, and certainly as it relates to the Asia-Pacific region. And again, it is truly a pleasure and a privilege to be on this panel with colleagues discussing these issues. I thought I might just address my remarks to three questions. The first question is, what might be in the forthcoming arms sales package to Taiwan? The second question is, what might Taiwan's aspirations and hopes be for the longer term, so for the Trump administration in the coming 3-4 years and beyond that? And then the final question is, what do American arms sales mean for Taiwan's defense and security interests and U.S.-Taiwan relations more broadly? So on the first question, of course, I can only speculate. I have read the same reports that I'm sure you have all read, and I've spoken to many of the same people that you speak to on a regular basis, and so I can only speculate. I think there's two possibilities for the next package. The first is a very modest package, a very routine arms sales package, and that would be probably something with an estimated value of about $1 billion. This would include things like contractor and maintenance support to the SRP. This is Taiwan's very advanced early warning radar. Taiwan maintains what may be the most powerful and sophisticated ground-based radar in the world on a mountain in northern Taiwan. And this is a very sophisticated capability. It's very expensive, but it's very capable as well. And what it allows is for Taiwan to have advanced early warning if there are air and missile activities in the mainland that suggest an attack may be imminent. So one part of the package may be continuing to support that. Another would be things like potentially spare parts for American C-130 aircraft. These are transport. The new Trump administration, as long as it has to announce what would be, in this case, a very routine arms sale, suggests that it actually may include more than that. It could include things like F-35s. It could include things like ATACMS, the Army Multiple Launch Rocket System. This is rocket artillery that would allow Taiwan's army, the ROC Army, to suppress a notional invasion force across the Taiwan Strait. It could include things like new Stinger missiles, new artillery, and perhaps technical support for Taiwan's indigenous defense submarine program. If that were the case, if it did include some of these other things, which are possible but unknown at this point, if that were the case, this arms sale would, of course, be much more significant. Not so much in terms for the dollar amount, although that would be something people would latch on to as a data point, but for the what that would mean for the strategic balance across the Taiwan Strait. Because, of course, while some of these capabilities, F-35s, for example, may not in and of themselves be a game changer, they would certainly change certain aspects of the game for Taiwan's security posture. The second question is, what are Taiwan's potential hopes and aspirations for the Trump administration? I think more than just the hardware, there's a desire at this point for the United States to reaffirm its commitment to the Taiwan Relations Act and President Reagan's 6 assurances to Taiwan. There has been a sense over the past several months that the U.S. may not be as committed to Taiwan's defense as initially hoped for. And of course, the best way to show that the United States maintains its commitments to Taiwan would be to have not only large and technologically sophisticated arms sales to Taiwan, but also to have regular arms sales to Taiwan in a very predictable manner, in a way that would tell the government of Taiwan and the people of Taiwan that they have the support of the United States. And so I think there is now an aspiration that we have very regular arms sales, because of course, about 10 years ago, in the latter half of the Bush administration, the U.S. government started bundling arms sales to Taiwan. And as a result, over the last 5.5 years, this September will mark the 6th-year mark, there's only been one arms sale notified to Taiwan. And of course, that has a very coercive effect on morale in Taiwan and on confidence in Taiwan, especially at a time when America's commitments to our treaty allies is already under question around the world. And so I think this will be a very significant development, and I think that is one of the desires that Taipei has. I think there's also a desire to make sure that arms sales are not the only manifestation of America's position on Taiwan's sovereign status, because at the current time, it is. There are very few other areas where the United States publicly reaffirms its support for Taiwan on the global stage. And so that becomes a single point of failure. At those times when arms sales are delayed or deferred for long periods of time, when they're frozen the way they have been in recent years, that really does send a very unhelpful message, I think, not only to Taiwan, but also to Beijing. And I think that's a message that potentially encourages Beijing to act in a much more coercive and potentially aggressive fashion. And so above and beyond arms sales, I think there's also a need for the new administration to consider things like general officer visits to Taiwan, joint military exercises, to invite Taiwan to RIMPAC, for example, next summer, to potentially consider ship visits to Taiwan. There are a range of things that the United States could do to signal commitment that unfortunately we have not been doing in recent years, but hopefully the new administration will. And then on the final question, what do arms sales mean for Taiwan's defense and security? I think as an analyst, you can approach this from multiple directions. One is you can look at the strategic level. This is the political level, really. Is what do arms sales say to the U.S. government? What does it say when the administration announces to Congress that it has this intention? What does it say to the government of Taipei? And what is the signal that it sends to the government and the PRC? I think at this strategic level, it sends the message that the administration is committed to the letter and the spirit of the law, the Taiwan Relations Act. It sends a message to Taiwan that it can count on the United States. They can count on our support. And it sends a message to China that coercive behavior and any sort of violence or aggression directed against Taiwan is unacceptable to the United States of America and to the Western world, the community of democracies more broadly. At the operational level, if you use that prism to look at what arms sales mean, arms sales have a very real impact that we often don't think about very much, and certainly we don't see. It has an impact on the generals and admirals on both sides of the Taiwan Strait that spend a lot of their careers thinking about, planning for, training and equipping and exercising to conduct military operations in the event that that has to happen. Of course, on the Taiwan side, arms sales have a very positive effect on Taiwan's defense posture, and it gives new sophisticated instruments to commanders in the ROC military. On the PRC side, it injects a very real sense of concern and uncertainty into the minds of war planners in China. And so, of course, that has a very positive effect from the American position, because that uncertainty is the kind of thing that you want in order to limit potentially coercive or violent behavior. And then at the tactical level, arms sales are very important for the average soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines in Taiwan, because they give them a sense of confidence. It has a real, almost palpable boost to morale in Taiwan. It convinces the soldiers that they have the best equipment in the world, and in some cases, things like the Apache attack helicopter sale to Taiwan did represent the most sophisticated variant of that capability in the world, or the Patriot 3 ballistic missile defense sale to Taiwan. Taiwan now has some of the most sophisticated ballistic missile defense capabilities on the planet. And so these types of arms sales are very important for the sense of confidence that it gives the average soldier in Taiwan as well. And so you can look at it from a number of different angles and using a number of different prisms, but taken as a whole, arms sales have a very positive effect on Taiwan's defense and security posture, has a very positive effect on US-Taiwan relations, and I would argue it has a very positive effect on cross-strait relations as well. And so going forward, as we go through the coming months and years of the Trump administration, I think this will be a very important area for us to continue watching. Thank you.
Okay. Well, it's a perfect time to turn it over to Susan, because, of course, Congress has an important role in signaling toward Taiwan, and I'd love to hear her thoughts on what we can expect from China this time around.
Okay, so I'll start with Congress. Ian just referenced the Taiwan Relations Act. I think Congress has always had a very strong sense of ownership when it comes to the Taiwan Relations Act. To go back into a little bit of that history, you'll all recall that when the Carter administration established diplomatic relations with the PRC, broke diplomatic relations with Taiwan, it then forwarded to Congress legislation to maintain an unofficial relationship with Taiwan. That initial legislation was very much focused on creating an unofficial instrumentality to manage the relationship, the American Institute in Taiwan. It was Congress that added in security provisions to the legislation, including the security provision that allows for Taiwan arms sales. So it's that line that among those security provisions, that it is U.S. policy to maintain the capacity of the United States to resist any use of force, but also the Taiwan arms sale provision that the United States, quote, will make available to Taiwan such defense articles and defense services in such quantity as may be necessary to enable Taiwan to maintain a sufficient self-defense capability. So that is a core provision of the Taiwan Relations Act. The Taiwan Relations Act is U.S. law. So administrations are required to implement it, and Congress has tried very hard over the years to ensure that the Taiwan Relations Act is implemented. And you see that particularly in the language of the National Defense Authorization Act. Every year there's language in the bill itself, often related to Taiwan, but there's more fulsome language usually in the conference report from the conference managers. And just to give you some examples, I mean, in the NDAA for FY 2017, you had the conference report directing the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State to provide a briefing to the Congressional Defense Committees on steps the United States has taken, plans to take, and will take to provide Taiwan with arms of a defensive nature in accordance with the Taiwan Relations Act. And the conferees went on to state that they believe the U.S. should conduct regular transfers of defense articles and defense services with the government of Taiwan, support the efforts of Taiwan to integrate innovative and asymmetric capabilities, including, and they go into details, undersea warfare capabilities optimized for the defense of the Taiwan Strait, assist Taiwan in building an effective air defense capability consisting of a balance of fighters and mobile air defense systems, and permit Taiwan to participate in bilateral training activities hosted by the United States. So that's not binding language, but that is the language in the conferees. It's sending a very strong signal of Congress's views on this issue. And it's something Abe can talk about, how the Department of Defense views conference report language from Congress associated with the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. But it's very significant language. It's usually taken very seriously by the Department of Defense and the executive branch in general. So that was, 2017, there was pretty fulsome language related to Taiwan. In 2016, you similarly had language in the conference report. We believe that the United States, in accordance with the Taiwan Relations Act, should continue to make available to Taiwan defense articles and services as may be necessary to enable Taiwan to maintain a sufficient self-defense. That's, again, language from the Taiwan Relations Act. And again, the United States should continue to support the efforts of Taiwan to integrate innovative and asymmetric capabilities to balance the growing military capabilities of the People's Republic of China, including, and again, we get details of what Congress is looking for, fast attack craft, coastal defense cruise missiles, rapid runway repair systems, offensive mines, and submarines optimized for the defense of the Taiwan Strait. So Congress is signaling pretty strongly its position. The other piece of this, you'll have seen in the last few years an effort by some in Congress to raise the profile of the 6 assurances. These were the commitments that the Reagan administration conveyed to Jiang Jingguo, the then president of Taiwan, in 1982, ahead of the issuance of the 3rd US-China joint communique, which focused on arms sales. And those 6 assurances, the executive branch, of course, has never issued a definitive text of what those assurances were. And there are various different versions of the 6 assurances that have floated around, some quite different in their provisions. Last Congress, in the 114th Congress, you for the first time had legislative language passed in the Congress that put the 6 assurances in writing. So it's the first time that you had a US official body issue a version, the version of the 6 assurances. And those 6 assurances, I mean, among the challenges with the 6 assurances has been trying to determine what the verb tenses should be in those 6 assurances. First, what are the 6 assurances? Second, what are the verb tenses associated with them? So operative components of the 6 assurances for the arms sales debate include that in negotiations with the PRC, in negotiating the 3rd communique, the United States did not agree to set a date certain for ending arms sales to Taiwan. What the Congress did with these 2 concurrent resolutions that passed Congress in the last session, it was H-Con Res 88, S-Con Res 38, identical language as passed. They went back to the testimony that John Holdridge, the then U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, provided to the Congress on the 3rd communique. So he came before Congress right after the issuance of the 3rd communique, gave testimony. Woven into his testimony were a series of these assurances which seemed to mirror assurances that the Taiwan government issued a document saying that the US had made assurances to Taiwan and listed them. So Holdridge came before Congress and gave testimony in which he didn't identify 6 assurances, but woven into his testimony were these assurances. And so Congress chose to use the language from that testimony. It was the executive branch's testimony to Congress on essentially what the 6 assurances were. So you had this language: we did not agree to set a date certain for ending arms sales to Taiwan. So you will see some versions of 6 assurances which change that tense and say the US will not set a date for ending sales to Taiwan, or the US would not set a date for ending sales to Taiwan. And it remains somewhat contested territory. But you have those two you have those two concurrent resolutions, which have put out the text from the original testimony. Anyway, you will see Congress has consistently over the last few years tried to raise the profile of those 6 assurances. And you've seen that also in the NDAA report language and in other fora. So moving to the Chinese reaction to arms sales, again, it's useful to go back to history. So as far as China was concerned, when the United States established diplomatic relations with China, broke relations with Taiwan, there was a communique at the time. China felt that arms sales were an unresolved issue, that that still needed to be resolved in the US-China relationship. In 1982, there was this third communique, which from China's perspective was the goal was to try to resolve this issue, resolve the issue of arms sales. And of course, the third communique included, I'm just going to find my third communique language. Okay, so the third communique stated that the United States intended gradually to reduce its sales of arms to Taiwan, leading over a period of time to a final resolution, suggesting that the US would, at some point, wind down arms sales to Taiwan. So in terms of legal force, the Taiwan Relations Act has the force of law. The third communique with China is an executive decree. It's a very important executive decree. All 3 are very important executive decrees in setting the guidelines for the US-China relationship, but they do not have the force of law. Similarly, the 6 assurances do not have the force of law, although Congress has now put them in these concurrent resolutions, but again, resolutions are not binding, but it's kind of put some force of Congress behind them in the last session of Congress. So that's just a bit of the landscape. In general, China always objects to arms sales to Taiwan. China continues to feel that this is an unresolved issue in the US-China relationship, and it needs to be resolved. And I guess for China, generally, the strength of China's response seems to be related to the size of the package. There's that number attached to it, and also to the sophistication of the weapons involved. But also, China's reaction seems to be somewhat calibrated to the situation in the Cross-Strait relationship. So we saw the Obama administration's last set of arms sales notified to Congress in 2015, December 2015. China seemed to have a somewhat more calibrated response to that set of arms sales than it had maybe to some previous arms sales. Possibly related to the size of that package. It was relatively modest. It was $1.72 billion in foreign military sales. There was a higher number the administration gave, but they were including a direct commercial sale, which was an unusual way to present that package. But the foreign military sales, which is the core piece, was $1.72 billion, which was lower than previous packages had been. There's also that issue of the sophistication, and I guess China felt that package perhaps did not have elements in it that were going to be, that it considered to be particularly challenging from a defense perspective. And then the third piece, though, was that Taiwan was going to be heading into a presidential and legislative election in January 2016. And I think there may have been some thinking on the Chinese side that they wanted to be careful about how they responded to this arms sale so as not to affect the outcome of that election in Taiwan in a negative way from China's perspective. So if they reacted, if they lashed out, they may have feared that they might be sending support towards the DPP, which has had a more skeptical view of China than the KMT. And so that timing may have affected their response too. Currently, of course, we have a DPP president in Taiwan. Relations between Taiwan and Beijing are strained. And so that could affect the response that China would have to any arms sale. Maybe I'll stop there.
Great. All right, and we'll turn it over to Abe, who can talk a little bit more about what a Taiwan arms sale might mean for the Trump administration's general Asia-Pacific strategy.
Well, thank you, and thank you to the Scowcroft Center and the Atlantic Council for hosting us and for putting on an important conversation about U.S.-Taiwan relations, about the arms sale. I'm very glad that they were able to have this, enable this discussion. I'm in a bit of an awkward position in that I don't feel I'm the right person to be speaking about the Trump administration's strategy towards Taiwan, and I suspect they would agree with me. So I'll give you my sense of how these things fit in. And I'll start by talking about, more generally, any administration, when it starts, since the signing of the Taiwan Relations Act, will need time to develop strategies. And I think it's very natural and very understandable. And that's especially true with issues such as Taiwan, where the issues are very complex and very nuanced. And you tend to get this dynamic in a new administration, in which you have people very well versed in U.S.-Taiwan relations, people who can recite parts of the Taiwan Relations Act from memory, sort of the high priesthood of U.S.-Taiwan relations, several of whom are in this room. Explaining to new officials about what's important, why this matters, and why they need to be careful about the language that they use. Even to the point, not during my previous position, but earlier when I was in government as a junior officer, getting to the point of writing down the key language of the holy text and laminating it for senior officials to put in their pocket in case they're ever asked about it, just to make sure they get the language exactly right. And often in those conversations, the new officials will ask fairly basic questions about why do we do things this way? Why, we have this, arms sales process established. Why do we do it this way with Taiwan, or with other partners we don't do it in the same way? And I think it's a good process. I think it's a healthy process because it forces us to address some of our preconceptions and make sure that our approach doesn't get stale. And personally, that's how I see the famous phone call between President-elect Trump and President Tsai as an outgrowth of that, in which you had people who were not versed in U.S.-Taiwan relations deeply, just asking questions, saying, she called me, why can't I talk to her? And if the answer doesn't satisfy them, they do it. And so I think that's a very natural process, and it goes into the broader question of the Trump administration strategy towards Asia and how arms sales to Taiwan would fit into that. It takes time to develop these broad strategies. And I would add, it's especially difficult when you don't have assistant secretaries at the State Department or at the Defense Department in order to build out those strategies, let alone the DAS's folks like me to do the writing and to help with that interagency process. Not that it's not impossible, but it complicates and makes that endeavor more difficult. So I want to give them the appropriate time to be able to come up with a broader strategy. At this point, from my perspective, what I can see is fairly distinct strategies and approaches to distinct issues in the Asia-Pacific, but I've yet to see them coalesce into a broader Asia-Pacific strategy. So we've seen strategies toward the Korean Peninsula. I think we've started to see strategies toward the South China Sea, definitely towards China more broadly in the president's engagements with President Xi. But one thing that we haven't seen a great deal of is a strategy toward Taiwan. The administration has actually been fairly quiet about Taiwan policy, both in word and in deed. And what we have seen primarily have been tweets or media statements from the president, which seem to point in various directions, depending on the time. So I would say that the overall strategy towards Taiwan from the Trump administration at this point, to me, seems unclear. Doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have one. I haven't seen it be clearly explained or elucidated yet publicly. But I do think that we can look at the president's record before the campaign previously was very supportive of arms sales to Taiwan. Even to the point of you can find tweets, I think going back to 2011, criticizing President Obama for not providing F-16s to Taiwan, for example. So there's a record of support of arms sales to Taiwan from Trump before he went into the campaign. But where he is on those issues now is impossible for me to say. I don't expect to see major change from an arms sale. There are still lingering questions on issues like F-35 is out there, submarines are out there. So it's certainly possible. Not something that I expect, but it's certainly possible. But I think that we need to broaden the aperture a bit, something that Ian mentioned as well, that our relationship with Taiwan needs to be about more than arms sales. And there are a lot of other things that we do with Taiwan. In the military sphere, in the diplomatic sphere, in the economic sphere, the social sphere. But they don't get nearly as much play or media attention as arms sales. And I think there's things that we can do more beyond arms sales. Ian talked about high-level military exchanges, general officers visiting, senior officials visiting, port calls, things like that. I think that's certainly areas to look at. But I would also think that we need to look beyond the military sphere, that our relationship with Taiwan should be considered in a more comprehensive way beyond arms sales and military exchanges. For example, looking at international space for Taiwan, in that recently Taiwan's ability to participate in international health organizations has been more constrained than it was before. There are things that the United States can do about that. If Taiwan's not able to go to WHA, we can send the CDC to Taiwan and make sure that their views and their requests are represented in those meetings, even if they can't be there physically. And that's just another example. That's just one example of ways that the United States can work with Taiwan and try to advocate for their international space. And the second area that I would focus on, and to me, I think is the most critical piece of our unofficial relationship with Taiwan, is trade and investment. China, I should say, Taiwan's long-term position in the region and in the world is dependent on its economy and its economic relationships with the Asia Pacific and with the United States. And Taiwan is, unfortunately, I believe, falling behind in its ability, in its economic relationships with the outside world. And the United States can do something about that by pursuing aggressively new agreements on trade and investment. We can both help diversify Taiwan's economic relationships, but also give some degree of political cover and strategic cover for other countries in the Asia Pacific who would be interested in engaging Taiwan economically, but would be nervous about facing the wrath of mainland China. If the United States is able to take a lead on that issue, I expect that other countries would follow as well. There's also a strategic side to this, as it is with a lot of trade arrangements in the Asia Pacific, in that there's a deterrence piece to increasing our economic relationships. I've heard someone say that a trade and investment agreement between the United States and Taiwan would be worth an aircraft carrier in deterrence. I think that's overstating a lot. Aircraft carriers are pretty great. But it does, I think, would send a very powerful signal about America's unofficial, yet very important commitment to Taiwan. A few other thoughts before I close things out on other pieces of strategy in our relationship with Taiwan. The role of Congress, of course, is very important. I'm glad that Susan talked about that, both in terms of raising expectations for the executive branch, expressing their sense of where things should go, as was described in the NDAA, most recent NDAA, but also providing the appropriate oversight function. That if Congress feels that an administration is being too quiet about a certain issue, they can request officials to testify and ask them questions. What is your policy? What is your strategy? What is your plan? I think that's a very appropriate role of oversight for the Congress. I would also point out that in about a year and a half, we're going to be approaching the 40th anniversary of the Taiwan Relations Act. And I think there's a role for the Congress to play of asking, this arrangement, many of whom who created it didn't expect it to last 40 years. The strategic environment in which the Taiwan Relations Act was created is wildly different than it was 40 years ago. There's no Soviet Union. The Cold War is over. China is the second largest economy in the world. Asking questions about, are there pieces of this arrangement of the Taiwan Relations Act that need to be adjusted for the new strategic environment, for the realities that we face now? I'm not saying that it should. I'm saying that it's a good question to ask. I think Congress has an important role to play in asking that question. And the 40th anniversary is probably a good time to start asking those questions. Finally, I wanted to emphasize the role of allies in our in our approach to Taiwan. Our allies can play an important role also in encouraging Taiwan to have international space, diversifying their economic and trade and investment relationships, but I would also say in the military sphere, that in an increasingly diversified technology space in which the United States is no longer the sole creator of high-end military technologies, that America's allies could also be potential sources of support for Taiwan's self-defense capability. If they are having trouble getting it from the United States, we could work with our allies so that they can get it from elsewhere. And there's countries in the Asia Pacific that would be potential sources, but I think at the Atlantic Council, it's also important to mention that Europe could also be an important source for technology, for international support, for trade and investment. Because fundamentally, at its core, and I'll kind of bring it back to strategy to stop here, is that we have an important interest in continuing to support Taiwan. Taiwan that is prosperous, that is connected economically, that is able to play an appropriate role internationally, that is able to defend itself and engage mainland China with confidence, is in America's interests. And I would add it's also in the interests of our friends and allies around the world. So from that basis, that calculation I don't expect to change. And I think it could be the basis for our engagement, not only with a more robust engagement with Taiwan, but also to bring that into conversations about Asia with our allies across Asia and around the world. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thanks to all three of you. Great remarks. I'm sure the audience is looking forward to asking you questions, but I'm going to sneak in a few of my own first. I'll start with you, Abe. You mentioned we haven't seen a whole lot from the administration yet on its Taiwan strategy. I was wondering what you made of Defense Secretary Mattis's comments on Taiwan at the Shangri-La dialogue.
Well, overall, I thought it was a very good speech. And I thought they were very welcome comments. And I was pleased to see that Taiwan was referenced in there. The language he used was, I thought, very careful. And that I believe he quoted directly from the Taiwan Relations Act, which is, I think, always a good move. And I think the broader signal, though, is that Taiwan is a part of our Asia strategy, at least how he conceives of it. And I thought it was a very welcome speech. The challenge coming out of it is that his speech focused a lot on rules-based international order, on support of our allies. I thought it was a very traditional speech that sounded very much in line with the policies of many administrations going back. What I think a lot of people at Shangri-La talked about, a lot of reactions, was that it also seemed a bit out of step with statements coming out of other parts of the government. And again, I think this is also a natural part of early administration dynamics, in which you have new people who have ideas, and they're expressing their ideas publicly, but they're also working in the interagency process to develop that strategy. So I think it's natural for people to be expressing their views in slightly different ways at the beginning. The key, though, is to use that process internally to develop a robust strategy and then be able to express it consistently across the bureaucracies. And what we haven't seen, we've seen Secretary Mattis and I think to a different degree Secretary Tillerson speaking about the importance of allies, the importance of robust engagement in the region, and of course Mattis mentioning Taiwan, but we haven't really seen that cohesive approach yet that I expect to see as the administration grows more mature and strategies become more developed across the interagency.
Okay, thanks. We'll all be, I'm sure everyone in this room will be paying very close attention as that develops. Okay, Susan, you kind of finished up your remarks with a hint that Beijing's reaction to a potential arms sale would be influenced by its cross-strait relationship, which is rocky right now. So given the current level of tensions, would you expect a more vocal reaction from Beijing, even to a fairly moderate arms package? Or do you think that they're mostly going to frame their response based on the size and amount of the arms being sold?
I think that I would expect primarily it will be the response to the size of the package and the sophistication, but it really depends when an arms package is announced. Where the relationship where the US-China relationship is at that point, and where the Cross-Strait relationship is at that point. And I think we don't know. We don't really have a good idea of when that package might get notified, and that's going to be a big variable.
Okay, and Ian, one for you as well. So you mentioned that the fact that we've seen such a lengthy delay in announcing an arms sale might hint that they are rethinking it, potentially making it more robust. A more pessimistic explanation might be that they're holding off while they try and pursue diplomacy in other areas with the PRC, particularly on North Korea issues. To what extent do you think that these broader calculations about the US-China relationship are impacting discussions on an arms sale to Taiwan?
Well, it's a very good question, and it's very difficult to assess from the outside. Certainly, what we've seen so far would indicate that the PRC factor is playing very large in this regard, but it's very difficult to assess. And if that were the case, of course, it'd be very regrettable, because the idea that we'd be trading on Taiwan's defense and security and on our own law in order to have some sort of accommodating agreement with the PRC over North Korea, when in fact the reason North Korea, of course, has ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons is because of Chinese technical assistance over the years. That would be, in my mind, a self-defeating approach. But again, I'm not sure that is. There's been a lot of speculation in that regard. I'm not sure that's the reason. I suspect the reason there has been a delay is because, as Abe pointed out, it is a new administration. They are in a period of transition. They're still working on their strategy, and these things do take time. That there's a process that if the Trump administration was just to go ahead and announce the package that was prepared by the Obama administration, that should be very easy. That could have happened really on day one of the administration. The fact that has not happened, that there has been a lengthy delay, could suggest that the new administration is reviewing a number of new capabilities and new platforms that would represent a much more robust package for Taiwan. Things like, again, F-35s, things like rocket artillery, things like technical support for Taiwan's indigenous defense submarine program. If that were the case, of course, that would take quite a lot of time, because there's a lot of bureaucratic hoops that would have to jump through. And I suspect that is probably the case, that when we do see the first package announced to Taiwan, and I think it's important to remember that this would just be the first of hopefully what will be many packages offered Taiwan in the coming years. When we do see that announcement made, I think it will probably reflect those issues.
Thanks, Ian. All right, we're going to kick it open to questions. I think we have a mic, so wait for the mic to come to you. Please do identify yourself and try and keep your questions brief so we can get in as many as possible. Let's start over here.
Thanks, Shannon. I'm Lada Danielson with the US-Taiwan Business Council. I just was interested to hear your thoughts on the indigenous defense industry in Taiwan and how the current Tsai administration has really focused on that piece, and how would that affect the potential current arms sales package and any future arms sales packages. Thank you.
Okay. Ian, you want to try to field this one?
Well, I think it's very positive in many regards. I think, of course, it's important for Taiwan to have the ability to indigenously produce its own capabilities. And in fact, while it's not often recognized, Taiwan has long had the ability to make a number of defensive weapon systems for itself. Taiwan, for example, has a very capable anti-ship cruise missile program, is a very capable long-range counter-strike missile program. Of course, Taiwan has indigenously developed some fast missile craft and a number of other capabilities over the years. So Taiwan already has that base that's there. And the unfortunate side of this, however, is that in recent years, that has become much more important because American arms sales to Taiwan have been frozen. The Obama administration, we saw just 3 arms sales notifications to Taiwan. And again, in the last 5.5, going on 6 years, there's only been 1, and it was fairly modest. And so in that sort of environment, it becomes increasingly important that Taiwan does have the ability to make sure that it can provide for its own defensive needs in that regard. But it's regrettable. If that's really the driver of the Tsai administration's focus on indigenous defense, that would be very regrettable, because Taiwan should be able to look to the United States for advanced defensive military capabilities, and it should be very regular and very reliable. But on whole, I would say it's a very positive development.
Susan, Abe, anything to add?
I don't have much to add. Lada, I think it's a good question. And I've had the opportunity to visit some of the defense industries in Taiwan recently. And they do very impressive work. And their ability to innovate is very impressive. And I do think that, at least for some in Taiwan, the emphasis on the indigenous defense industry is to make up for what they see as lacking support from the United States in terms of arms sales. I actually think it's okay that the United States should be able to not provide everything that Taiwan asks for at times. And if Taiwan really wants it, then they, I think, have every right to develop it themselves, or at least try to. One of the concerns I have, though, is that this is pretty hard stuff. They do have a very successful cruise missile program that took a long time to develop. And a lot of the capabilities that they're pursuing now, such as the indigenous submarine, takes a long time to develop and is very difficult. So I think we should manage expectations, especially when it comes to speed and cost. But overall, I think they have a terrific defense industry, and I think the appropriate approach, which I actually think is there now, is a mix. Is you develop some capabilities on your own, you acquire other capabilities from other places, which is how the vast majority of other places develop their defense capabilities as well. So I actually think it's a good mix now, but I'm a bit nervous about some of the optimism I've been seeing.
Okay. Come over here.
Thank you to the panel for very interesting presentations. Alan Romberg, Stimson Center. Abe, my question's for you about economics. You raised the issue of things other than military that the United States can do for Taiwan, and stressed economic agreements, for example. My question is whether you look at that as something that should be done on a grace and favor basis, or should be economically meritorious. And if economically meritorious, my question is, do you think Taiwan has the domestic political wherewithal to bring about the necessary changes?
It's a terrific question. When I saw Alan had a question, it made me very nervous. From one of the senior rabbis of US-Taiwan policy. I do think that it would require a lot of diplomatic capital in Taiwan. I would actually say that both sides have some need to change their approach to this. That Taiwan has a few policies on the economic side. I'm not an economist, so I can't speak to a great deal of detail on it, but there are several industries and several challenges in which Taiwan's ability to engage the United States economically is somewhat undermined by their own policies and by their own procedures. And so I think there would need to be a push domestically in Taiwan, as well as I think USTR would have to have a different approach as well. But the key here is my point is that this needs to be, I would argue this should be a higher priority for both sides. And that higher priority would mean that both sides expend the domestic capital they need to make the adjustments they need in order to enable a higher quality of economic engagement between the two sides. Not in terms as a favor, it would have to be based on economic principles of supply and demand and all that, but adjusting policies to make Taiwan a more attractive place for investment, so that the products that Taiwan's companies are producing are more attractive for foreign purchase, that to enable more FDI to flow into Taiwan. Similarly, to allow for a greater deal of economic and of trade and investment between Taiwan and the United States, I think is going to take movement on both sides. But my point is that it has to be a higher priority politically for them to make the adjustments necessary in order for it to happen.
I think considering the U.S. side of that coin as well is also important. How U.S. domestic dynamics.
Absolutely.
Obviously, TPP could have been an avenue for cooperation, and now that's off the table. So we both have our challenges.
Absolutely.
Oop, dropping things. All right. Come over here.
Hi, I'm Garrett Vanderwees. Thanks all for excellent presentation. I want to pick up something that Ian said, and said in the beginning that arms sales should not be the only manifestation of US-Taiwan relations. So the question is, how can we weave a broader framework for US-Taiwan relations? And I think the Obama administration actually started on some of that, the cooperative framework agreement and support for Taiwan in international organizations. I think Abe also kind of aimed at that. And so what can we do to make arms sales not the single point of failure that you were talking about?
Garrett, I would just associate myself with Abe's remarks regarding using economic tools, using political tools, for example, supporting Taiwan with the WHA and WHO, and there are so many areas that we can cooperate. If we just focus on defense and security, obviously we're missing a much bigger picture. But even in that area, there are a lot of things that we could do. There are so many decisions that get made, frankly, that are made in duress. That the major factor for why we don't do things is not because it's not in our interest. It is in our interest to do all these things with Taiwan. The reason we don't do it, and it's illogical, but unfortunately I think it's true, is because we're afraid of Beijing's reaction. And ultimately that is a flawed basis for making decisions and for making policy, is to constantly be asking, yeah, but if we do that with Taiwan, what will Beijing think? I think that's the wrong approach because, of course, the PRC has made it very clear that its long-term strategic intention is to annex or to conquer Taiwan and to end Taiwan's democracy. And that is something, of course, that is completely unthinkable and unacceptable to the United States and to the American people. And so when you look at it through that prism, it is so important that we do more than just arms sales, especially during a period of time when arms sales are constantly being held hostage. And so again, I would recommend, and these are not my ideas, there are a number of people, an entire community of people that have looked at these problems and said we do need to do, or at least to seriously consider doing ship visits to Taiwan. We need to consider a bilateral and multilateral exercise with Taiwan. We should consider inviting Taiwan to RIMPAC, at least, at a minimum, as an observer. we should invite Taiwan's Army to Fort Irwin and the U.S. Army Joint Training Center there, the Taiwan Marines to California to train with our Marines at 29 Palms, to invite the Navy to our naval training ranges, to invite their Air Force to things like Red Flag, Silver Flag, some of these exercises that would really provide Taiwan with a qualitative advantage over the PLA, because of course Taiwan cannot hope to outspend the PRC. And so there is an arms race going on, but really there's only one side that's truly racing forward, and that's China with its really incredible military buildup across the Taiwan Strait. And of course, so much of that's aimed at Taiwan. And so there are a number of areas where it's naturally in our interest to do these things, and it's very unfortunate that we haven't, because we're constantly in fear of really demarche from Beijing, because at the end of the day, that's all that happens, is the Chinese demarche you, and then you move on, and ultimately it's good for U.S.-China relations as well, because once you build that respect, that the United States is going to do what's in our interest to do, and what our law says that we're going to do, and that the PRC, of course, is going to do what it thinks is best. If we do that, and we show that we're not going to be manipulated, then that creates an atmosphere of respect. And I think when you do see breakthroughs in the U.S.-China relations, oftentimes it's actually related to the Chinese having that respect for an American administration that's built on this issue.
Right here in the front.
Thank you. Thank you, Dong Huiyu with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong. Susan, you mentioned that the Beijing's reaction will depend on the size of the package and the timing and the situation of the U.S.-China relations and the cross-strait relations. But I still have a question about it.
And the sophistication of the component pieces of the package.
Yeah, but my question is about the timing. Considering the situation of the cross-strait relations, that right now is pretty, tense, and U.S.-China relations, they have a lot of agenda to cooperate to each other. Do you believe there's any good timing of making this announcement? Somebody said before the 19th Party Congress, that would be the best opportunity to make this announcement. But some other people said it would be more dangerous to make this announcement before the 19th Party Congress. What do you think about that? And I also would like to hear about the view of other panelists.
This feeds into the whole, there's a sort of active debate, certainly on the Hill, there's an active debate about the approach that we've had on arms sales since 2008, this idea of putting several arms sales notifications together, bundling them and notifying them all on a single day to Congress. And I think the thinking behind doing that at the end of the Bush administration was the idea that you could, instead of, I think somebody put it to me, instead of blowing up the US-China relationship, multiple times over a year or two, you could just do it on one day and move on. But the challenge with that, though, is that you sort of create this issue where you're only going to do a notification. You're going to have a much longer time period between notifications, so they aren't routine and regular the way that perhaps they were prior to that, 2008. So I think there's been an active debate on, does it make sense to be bundling them all together on a single day? Would it make sense to go back to the previous policy, which was to a previous practice, which was to notify arms sales when they were ready? And so you had, prior to 2008, you had years where you had several arms sales notifications in a single year. It was unusual to go a whole year without an arms sale notification for a long time, from sort of 1980, into the 2000s. So in terms of timing, there are arguments to be made on both sides, I think. But certainly there are people on the Hill who have been advocating for the idea that, as you saw in that NDAA language, that arms sales need to be It was something, regular and routine or something like that. Yeah, anyway, that's the gist of the meaning. So that said, I mean, certainly you saw in the Obama administration that they did time certain actions that they knew were going to get some pushback from Beijing. They were careful about how they timed them. I'm thinking particularly about the President Obama's first meeting with the Dalai Lama in 2010. That was, I think the administration thought hard about how to time that, and they chose to have it come after the president's trip to China because they didn't want to upset that trip. They wanted to have good dynamics for that trip. And they got a lot of criticism for not having that meeting with the Dalai Lama before the president traveled to China at the end of 2009. But they held off. They didn't want to upset the trip. They didn't want to affect the Copenhagen climate change negotiations. But then they knew that they had scheduled the nuclear security summit for, I think it was April 2010. And they knew that they were going to be inviting world leaders to that, and that the president of China at the time, the General Secretary of the Communist Party, and President Hu Jintao would want to be there. So they timed that meeting with the Dalai Lama for, I think it was January 2010. So the idea was China would be upset, but it would have 3 months to cool off, and then Hu Jintao would want to come to the nuclear security summit in April, and so you could do that and move on. So I think there's a lot of gaming things like that. The timing, and and I think a Taiwan arms sale package, if you're bundling a whole lot of sales in one day and sending them all, notifying them all to Congress on a single day, that's something else. That's something that's going to get a reaction, and probably I don't know. I don't have any inside information, but I would imagine that administrations would be thinking hard about exactly what timing would make sense so as not to blow up something important going on in the U.S.-China relationship, and also have some way to bring the relationship back again, something that China wants to be a part of, to follow a sale.
Either of you want to add anything?
Real quickly. Right before, I believe it was the first notification from the Obama administration, I was working in a think tank, and I had a meeting with a Chinese friend. And there were rumors that an arms sale was coming. And the Chinese friend said to me, this is a bad time for an arms sale. Why would the U.S. do an arms sale now? This is a very bad time. And I said, tell me what's a good time. And they said, never a good time. I think the point of that story is that I think once you start down the road of how do we calibrate the timing of this arms sale so as to minimize Chinese reaction, I think that's a losing proposition. To me, the first question has to be, what does Taiwan need and when does it need it? And then, what is in U.S. interest to provide in a timely manner? And then once you have those key components, then you can start thinking about the other effects of that. But that can't be the key question about timing. I think that because that's a losing proposition, because there's never a good time. The question of whether or not to break it out into regular and routine arms sales is sort of a perpetual question. I've noticed in the last few years that people in the academic community tend to think that that's a better approach, and then when they go into government, it doesn't happen. And there's a good reason for that, is because if the Chinese are going to react badly, then you'd rather have one bad reaction than 12 or whatever. So I think a lot of this is on the Chinese side as well, is that this is not a necessary rule of nature, that the U.S. sells arms to Taiwan and China has to express things and things go bad for a few months before they cool off. That's a decision that China makes, as much as it is a decision that the U.S. makes. And I think China has a responsibility on that piece as much as the United States does.
I agree that it is a decision that the PRC makes. I absolutely agree. And I think what's regrettable is we had 4 arms sales notifications in 2007. And since that time, over the last 10 years, I think we've had 4 over 10 years. So we had 4 in 2007 over the course of the year, and then all of a sudden, we took this new approach, which validated Chinese coercion and China's zero-sum game. We validated it. We've showed them that it works on us. And so, of course, China has every incentive in the world to keep doing what they're doing and to blow up the relationship and to act in a very, really unfortunate way over arms sales. And so I think that is a challenge that we're going to have to face if we're going to have any sort of reasonable relationship with China. And we're not going to let the fact that we are strategic rivals and we are in a long-term strategic competition with China, if we're going to keep that stable and less intense than it otherwise may become, we really do need to think long and hard about some of these policy decisions. And we do need to look at the history and think about, okay, if 10 years ago we were doing it that way and the relationship was this way, and then over the past 10 years now we started to validate this coercive approach, and we're in a situation where it's not good for us and it's not good for our ally Taiwan, then maybe we do need to rethink that decision that has been made, and unfortunately has been made repeatedly since then.
And I add that this is something Congress has always sort of zeroed in on, the idea that the Taiwan Relations Act says that it requires, it says that the United States will provide arms to Taiwan, and that the decisions about those arms sales, should be, the issue is what are Taiwan's needs, right? That is the core piece, and so it shouldn't be affected by these other considerations. And there's always been a kind of pushback on the idea that it is affected by the broader political relationship.
Right? Yeah, here in the red.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Juliana, and I'm a student of International Affairs at FACAMP in Brazil. My question is about, in your opinion, how the possible increase in the arms sales to Taiwan would impact the tension we have nowadays in the Asia-Pacific. Would an increasing uncertainty have a more negative effect and possibly deepen the tensions? Thank you.
I think the opposite is actually true. It's a very good question. The question is, if we sell more to Taiwan, if we really open up the floodgates and we make really almost anything available to Taiwan, will that increase tensions in Asia? So as arms sales go up, will tensions go up? I would argue it's actually a very different relationship. I think we're much more likely to see, as U.S. support for Taiwan goes up, tensions will go down. Because of course, if we don't sell to Taiwan, or if we very much limit what we sell to Taiwan, that is again validating China's coercive approach. And it's encouraging a temptation towards further coercion, if not eventual violence, in a crisis situation across the Taiwan Strait. If Taiwan is better defended, Taiwan will naturally be more confident. And if Taiwan is better defended, the PLA will naturally be constrained in its behavior and will be less confident and less likely to engage in acts that could really spiral out of control in this context. And so I think we're shooting ourselves in the foot every time that we really moderate ourselves in this regard. And if we think that arms sales are the trigger for tensions, I think we're missing something very important.
Okay, let's go in the very back here.
Thank you, Rita Chen from the Central News Agency. My question is about the F-35 to Abraham. You just mentioned that you don't expect to see any major change about the arms sale. Does that mean that Taiwan is highly unlikely to get the F-35 day one? If so, why? And is there any other option that Taiwan could have? Thank you.
Well, what I said was that I don't expect any major change, but there still are lingering questions about F-35 and about support to submarines, to the indigenous submarine program. So I don't have any special knowledge about whether or not F-35s are going to be coming down the pike for Taiwan. although it is a question that's in the air. There certainly are a lot of options. To me, the real question for Taiwan's defense, especially when it comes to very expensive pieces like F-35, is less about the specific system and more about the resources. That for several years now, both major parties in Taiwan have supported defense budgets at roughly 3% of GDP, yet spending has been below that. And that limits what Taiwan can invest in, either in terms of arms sales or in terms of indigenous development. And so to me, when the conversation turns to the potential acquisition of very expensive systems, I start to ask, what does that mean Taiwan will not be able to buy? Because there are a lot of capabilities that I believe would be very effective in terms of asymmetric, innovative capabilities that would greatly complicate the mainland's ability to invade or coerce Taiwan. And to me, those sorts of capabilities should have the highest priority in terms of investment. So when we talk about very expensive capabilities, my question is, if Taiwan is investing in that, what are they not investing in order to pay for that? Because of their very restricted defense budget. So they do have a lot of options. F-35 is not the only option. Just recently, we talked about how, friends in Taiwan and other analysts were talking about how important it was that we upgrade the F-16ABs, and that Taiwan would not be able to defend itself if it didn't get these upgrades. And then it got the upgrades that it needed, and a few years later it says, well, we need F-35s because we can't defend ourselves without F-35s. And I understand that dynamic. Threats change. The threat to Taiwan has intensified. And it is important to continually build on capabilities. So my personal take on F-35, and I talked about this when I visited Taiwan a few weeks or months ago, is that it's a very complicated issue, and that in my experience, the U.S. and Taiwan are most successful when we work together on this. So before I want to say yes or no, I believe it's an issue that the two sides should work together to study, to look at not only what role would these planes have, but what kind of investments would they need in terms of infrastructure and support and sustainment. How would that fit in with Taiwan's broader defense budget planning? Before I would want to weigh in on whether or not I think it's a good idea. So, overall, I don't know if it's going to happen or not, but I hope that we're able to have enough time to actually study the issue in depth before we make any substantial commitments one way or another.
Okay. Yeah, here in the front.
Thank you for coming. My name is Mitsuo Nakai, a member of Reagan Foundations. My question is, I just keep wondering, why F-35? Why not a submarine, for example? I heard Taiwan can develop their own submarines. That's what I heard. I don't know for sure if it's going to be possible. They may be working on it. If that was the case, is there anything Japan can help Taiwan? Maybe a technology transfer, whatnot. Number two, speaking of Chinese pressure and some of the countries in the Asia Pacific that are afraid of Chinese pressure. Is what you said is right, but can you expand on that? Is there anything we can do to ease that?
Well, it's a very good question. Let me start with the latter question first. What we can do is set an example. There are countries around the world that look to the United States as an example of what they should do, and they feel a tremendous sense of confidence when the United States is going in a certain direction that they can follow. We are the world's only superpower. We are the leader of the free world. And in many ways, we set the tone not only for other democracies, but for countries around the world in so many regards. And this, of course, is one of them. We are the only country that has anything like a Taiwan Relations Act with Taiwan, that we have that sort of legal commitment to Taiwan. There are no other examples of that you can see anywhere. We are the only country that does offer Taiwan defense articles and services. And so what we can do to encourage others to follow our lead is to lead. That's what we need to do. And as for why F-35 versus the IDS program, the Indigenous Defense Submarine Program versus something else, I don't think it's an either or. I think when you look at the severity of the threat that Taiwan faces, the massive buildup, I mean, the DoD report to Congress this week on China's military modernization program highlighted this very well, that Taiwan faces a threat really unparalleled. There are no other democracies in the world that face an invasion threat the way Taiwan does. And we're not talking about Russia. We're talking about China, which is a far more dangerous threat to our ally because, of course, it's a much greater economy, it's got greater staying power, and it has much more influence around the world and around the region. And so the threat is really unparalleled. And what that means for Taiwan military planners and for strategists at the political level in the presidential office in Taiwan is that they need to be prepared for a whole range of different contingencies. And they need to think in terms of the strategic effects of capabilities like submarines and F-35s, the operational effects and the tactical effects. And those are going to be different. They also have to think about what is the reaction of Parliament. Because, of course, Parliament, the legislative yuan, plays a very powerful role in Taiwan. What is the reaction of the media? What is the reaction of industry and of the population more broadly? Are these programs supported? Are they not supported? What constituencies support them and why? There are so many different things to consider. And so that's why I think when the president of Taiwan herself, Tsai Ing-wen, comes out and requests F-35s, as she has done publicly on several occasions, I think it's very important that we very strongly and positively consider that, because only the president of Taiwan ultimately can understand, first of all, Taiwan's defense plans, which are classified and not known to the American side and not shared with us, in the same way that we don't share our operational plans with others. And she was going to have the best read on what is politically sensible in her country. And so I think it's generally a good idea, and is the general practice of the United States government, to look at what our allies want. And that's why we don't second guess when Japan requests F-35s. We don't second guess when South Korea requests F-35s or other capabilities. We don't second guess, as a general rule, our allies. We try to be accommodating. And I think we should, of course, have the same policy towards Taiwan and treat Taiwan just as we would any other defense and security partner.
Okay, I think we have time for just one more. So we'll go back here standing.
Good morning, and thank you for having this. And I'm Yukio from Okinawa, Japan, which is very close to Taiwan, and which is the southwest part of Japan. And we have a very good relationship with Taiwan. Lots of tourists coming to Okinawa, and Taiwan was kind of a role model for our economics. And at the same time, we have a problem. I mean, we have issues that U.S. military issues, which is very political in Okinawa. And what do you see? I'd like to ask you that. What would you, Trump administration, that you mentioned that Trump administration could review military issues or military presence in Asia Pacific, and do you think it would occur in? Well, sorry, I'm kind of lost. Is there any chance that Trump administration could change U.S. military's presence in Asia Pacific? My question, sorry, it's kind of hard to tell, but so.
Abe, you want to try
So,
this?
sure. So I visited Okinawa many times. The last time I was there was with the commander, the Marine commander, as well as Ambassador Kennedy, for the return of the Northern Training Area to the people of Japan, the largest return since the 1970s. So it's a issue that I was very focused on when I was in the Pentagon. Of course, I'm not going to be able to speculate as to how the Trump administration may adjust our military posture in the region. So I'll just speak of it in fairly broad terms, is in that in the Obama administration, we made a very concerted effort to review our military posture as part of the rebalance and to ensure that we developed a military posture that was effective, distributed, and sustainable. And we, I think, had a lot of success in that over the 8 years of the Obama administration. So that by the end of the Obama administration, our military was in a much better position than when we started. And Okinawa is, of course, a very important part of that. I couldn't speculate as to how the Trump administration may want to do that, but I do think it's only natural for any administration to look at our posture and ask, does this still make sense for the challenges we face, for our capabilities, for the capabilities of our potential adversaries. And of course, Okinawa is an important piece of our posture in the region. So I can't speculate as to what may happen, especially when it comes to Okinawa. But I do not expect that Okinawa's importance is going to change. There, of course, have been, you've seen the same media reports that I have. And I believe the Commandant testified about this a bit a couple weeks ago. But what may be behind that, discussions may or may not be occurring, I really couldn't comment on.
Well, thank you all for joining us for this discussion, and a special thanks to our panelists. Let's give them a round of applause. I know.